Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name's Ann Morgan. I'm the chair of the Toronto Police Service Board, and I'd like to welcome you all to this hybrid meeting of the board's budget subcommittee. We acknowledge that the land that we are on as we hold this meeting is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The board also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. At this point, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act or the Code of Conduct for the Police Service Board members? Seeing none, let us proceed. I'd like to turn over the meeting's logistics to our Board Executive Director, Dr. Buchanan Gisser.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for everyone who has joined us in person as well as online to this meeting. Please note that this meeting is also being live-streamed on the Toronto Police YouTube account and will be available there at the conclusion of the meeting. Joining us in person, we have members of the Board's Budget Committee, Chair Ann Morgan, Councillor Shelley Carroll, and joining online, Board Member Nick McLeory. We also have members of our Board Office staff, Chief Demkew, and our CAO, Savina Dhaliwal, members of the service, and of course, members of the public. We have individuals who have registered to make deputations, both in person as well as virtually, on our agenda items. As per our regular meeting process, deputations will be heard prior to the item being discussed and voted on by board members. When it comes time to do a deputation, those who have registered will be called upon and brought into the meeting or step up to the podium to the audience's left. As always, deputants will speak, followed by an opportunity for board members to ask them questions. Chair?
Thank you, Dr. Cannon-Gisser. So we proceed with item number 1, and we will start with the Toronto Police Service Budget Update presentation. Deputy Dhaliwal, will that be you? Or Director Williams?
Yes, I will kick it off. We'll just wait a minute or two. We'll
All
just
right,
wait
well,
for the presentation to...
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, I think we can get started. I was just practicing to make sure I can click from this far. So this is our third budget committee meeting, and so the last one before the full budget comes to the board in December 12th. So today, what we're going to do is really, we don't often in the full board meetings get the opportunity to deep dive on specific topics in the budget. So what we wanted to do today was really spend time on a few areas that are of interest, but where we won't go as deep next at the December meeting, and we'll use the opportunity today to do so. So we will talk about the hiring plan following the motion that was approved at the last board meeting and get into what that hiring plan actually means in terms of headcount and hiring. We will talk about the staffing model. So we've spent a few meetings referencing third-party analysis through that we're working with Environics on looking at different ways to model out shifts and demand. And so we'll give an update on that. We will also talk about the budget survey. So we had worked with Forum Research. Every year we do this, where we also do a telephone survey of 1,500 residents across the city. And so Forum Research, as well as our staff, are here to talk about what those results say. And then one of the notable things in our capital program is an update to 5455, which has been on pause effectively for 2 years. And so we wanted to provide an update on direction as well as gain support, as that's what we have now built into the capital plan. So it's a kind of a potpourri of topics that we'll dive into with a small update on really where we're at in terms of the overall budget. Darren, can you go to next slide? So very quickly, the first two meetings, we've talked about the different scenarios. I had mentioned that each meeting effectively will build on each other. We talked about our strategic direction. We've talked about a number of our budget considerations. Last meeting, we talked about a number of operational metrics that Director Williams provided. And then on the next slide, we spent some time in, I think, budget meeting number 1, talking about our modernization efforts and the cumulative cost avoidance that we've managed to achieve. The key cost drivers, which we'll go through again today, that inform our budget, a quick overview on our capital program, and our key priorities, which do remain unchanged from last year as we are continuing kind of the same programs and the same multi-year hiring plan. So last month, we did receive direction in terms of a board motion around what we should build in for the budget. And so we have done that. We've effectively built in 4 classes of 90 cadets for the next 2 years. And then we looked at where kind of that notional COP to POP would be at the end of 2026, and then carried that through as replacement hires for the next 3 years. And so we'll talk about what all that means. And so then in terms of the budget timeline, we are nearing now the final stages of being able to finalize our board reports and publish a number. All of that will be available next week ahead of the December 12th meeting. We are receiving instructions and continue to from the city on city notes as input into their process, which will start in January. And so very quickly, if we get into the actual multi-year hiring plan, so this lays out what that direction meant. And what it basically says is in 2025, if our separations are about right, it translates to about net new 109 officers. In 2026, that turns to about 140. And then for the following 3 years, it levels out to about 80 a year on average. So over a 5-year period, from 2025 to 2029, that translates to 500 new officers over a 5-year period, plus replacing those we lose along the way to retirements and separations. In terms of, what is our going in position of how we would allocate this, Generally, it's like a 70-30 model. We sort of know 70% need to go on the front line. That's not only to accommodate growth, but it is also to try and address and improve upon our response times. And then there's usually a portion that would then go to support the investigative support efforts. Now, the give and take on those two numbers is there is still a portion that we want to continue to invest in terms of expanding the neighborhood community officer program. And so what you will hear for 2025 is that we would like to expand for up to 4 new neighborhoods. We would like to put around 80 new officers on the front line, and then about 24 would go to the investigative areas. That's not to say that it solves all of our operational gaps. You know, there is still a lot of reform. There's the new records management program. There's the Auditor General report. So there's still a number of reform activities that do require the subject matter expertise and do require sworn officers to do the work. And so even on top of our hiring plan, what we are still anticipating is some degree of internal reallocation, which is a normal part of our business, to make sure that the most pressing and urgent priorities are being met. So, you know, examples of that is, you know, carjacking task force was necessitated by the trends in the crime rates. Augmenting the hate crime unit was required based on the stats that we were seeing. So that kind of look of where things are going relative to the resourcing we have, we are still anticipating reallocation and adjustments to our service delivery over and above the hiring that we're doing in order to make sure, you know, the most critical and urgent gaps are being addressed. And so this just provides a historical view of where we were in 2000, where we're at in 2029, and sort of where the population has grown with it. I think the thing to know about this is that, you know, we are not the service we were also in 2000. We have been changing over the years as well, whether it's through civilianization, whether it's adding technology to create more capacity, whether it's redirecting work, you know, introducing partnerships, referrals. So it's not always an apples to apples comparison, but it does provide a historical perspective and a sense of where, you know, some of the kind of earlier periods where austerity kicked in and where now we're starting to build a little bit back better in a way, but also still comparatively leaner than, you know, the 2000 era. But, you know, the other notable thing to say is by the end of 2025, we will be in and around, you know, 5,500. By 2026, we'll be at levels that had not been seen before. You know, the last time we were around 5,600 would have been around 2010, 2011. So certainly being able to build back is important. But the city in that time has also grown considerably, and the pressures look quite different. This provides just a month-by-month view, because when we talk about our deployed strength, we talk about year-end deployed. But really, if someone said, but what are you at on average, it's considerably less, and that's because our separations are often front-end loaded. And the other relationship to bear in mind is if you're hiring a cadet class in September, for example, that cadet class is actually deployed the next year. And so there is, you know, a relationship just to consider. If we say we're hiring 360 in a given year, because that's the 4x90, 2 of those classes, the September and December class, actually deploy the following year. And so it's just an important sort of relationship to know that hiring doesn't always equal deployment, because there is a 6-month lag. And so the hiring plan, part of the hiring plan was the civilian component of it. And while the board motion does not explicitly call for net new positions, what we will do is for each budget process, we will include as part of our request any new civilians that need to be hired or any new additional complement that we are requesting. So for 2025, we are not requesting net new complement, and the reason is there is still some reallocation internally we will attempt to do for any pressing and urgent needs. And what you will also see is that, communication operators as an example, we have vacancies and we're still trying to hire up to our approved strength. And so we are still hiring civilians, so it's not to say we're not. And what you see here is we wanted to explicitly lay out some of the classes that can be expected. So we are going to hire 3 classes of 30 communication operators. What that allows us to do is not only reach our approved complement, but actually get ahead of the upcoming separations so that, towards the end of the year, we're not just only catching up with separations. For special constables, we are still doing 2 small classes. We expect to do, and this is on top of this year, we just have onboarded a class of 30 in December, and we also had a class of 50 in August. So based on the separations, because special constables and parking enforcement officers are a big kind of feeder pool into the cadet pool, so these are notional numbers, and then when we see what our strength is around those times, we'll adjust our number accordingly. Same with parking enforcement. We are planning 2 classes. The size will likely depend on what that current strength is at that time. And I think the other thing I always like to remind everyone when we talk about civilians, the true corporate civilian footprint is quite steady. It's always 8 to 10% of our total workforce. For us, civilians are direct, frontline, court officers, bookers, comm operators, and those that are directly supporting the front line, like property and evidence, FIS, crime scene technicians, fleet mechanics. So the true corporate footprint that I think most would sort of think civilians are, and certainly in a public sector or corporate environment, for us, that's actually only 8-10% of what we're talking about. And now I'm going to turn it over to Director Williams, as well as Emily Much and Lay, who are going to talk about some of the modeling that we're currently doing that we will start to use in the new year to inform deployment, and where you'll see this modeling come in maybe in a more direct way would be kind of in next year's budgets onwards.
Thank you. So just to piggyback off the CAO's comments, we're going to provide an overview of some of the staffing model work that we've been undertaking. This is the continuation of work that's been going on for some time. You'll have seen, of course, at board presentations, our emphasis on understanding response times and the resources that get applied to those. These staffing models use that same data to help us continue to dive deeper, to generate insights, and to develop continuous models around resourcing and demand for our services. So what we're going to provide today is an overview of some of the capabilities that we will have as we look forward, specifically to future budget, staff planning, and resource allocation discussions, particularly around the PRU. So what you'll see today is based on PRU constable data and the demand for those resources across the service, and our ability to explore some of the levers in which we can apply to scenarios as we look forward, and to be able to address response times in a particular way, or to be able to plan for additional types of calls that we expect to receive, or as we look at diversion opportunities, to allow us to plan for those, continuing to use evidence to base those decisions and to support continued discussion and collaboration as we generate those scenario-based models. And so I think important to note that we've been doing this as we've continued to improve our data management posture, and this is an evolution of that. We've done a lot of this work in partnership with Environics Analytics. We've got some of our colleagues with us here today, and I will turn it over now to Emily and Lay, who've been central in bringing this work to life at TPS.
Thank you so much, Ian, and good afternoon, everyone. So the genesis of this project were specific recommendations made by the Auditor General of Toronto in July 2022 in the review of our response to the services calls for service response. So the goal of the project was to have Environics Analytics build us a staffing analysis. Thank you. Staffing analysis, an administration tool to facilitate our ability to determine appropriate time targets for priority 1 and priority 2 response times, to identify the accurate number of PRU officers required to achieve our identified targets, and then ongoing monitoring and measurement of performance to demonstrate improvement. So the resulting solution that Embryonics has built for us are 2 staffing models. They work together. A workforce performance-based model that allows us to determine the appropriate number of officers required to meet our demand and to forecast additional resource requirements based on population growth and other factors. And a queuing model that establishes a link between pending time and response time, along with required officer resources to meet time targets. These 2 models, when used together, will assist TPS with our goal of better aligning service delivery and resource allocation to key metrics and outcomes. And as Ian mentioned, representatives from Embryonics Analytics have joined us here today, and we'd like to thank them for all of the excellent work that they've done their team has done to build these 2 models for us. Thank you. So looking at the models a little bit more specifically, the workload performance model applies a series of linear calculations to estimate the number of officers required to meet our call volume demands, both citywide and at the divisional level. We'll be using this model to measure and validate how we currently respond to calls. The outputs of this model will also be used by TPS staff to perform an analysis of how we've been using our resources to respond to current demands, including things like callbacks. We'll also be able to assess the resources required to meet increases in call demands. And with this model, the service will be able to estimate and understand how changes in volume of work or other operational changes will impact staffing levels. So an example of that might be a shift schedule change. I'll now turn the presentation over to Lei, and she'll go into this model in some more detail.
Good afternoon, everyone. And so in early October, Embryonics has delivered the first model to our service. And as you can see from the slide here, this model have a simple interface to allow us to adjust the parameters that can affect the workload for the primary response units. And the output model is a projected primary response officer needed. And since we received this model, we have further validated the model using the past 12 months data, which is from November of 2023 to the 2024 October, and have confirmed that the model is accurate, the model's accuracy, and it's only when you compare to the actual average numbers, it's only off by 7, which is 0.4%. So we're very happy with the model result. And to demonstrate a little bit more about how we can leverage this model, we have presented a simple user case. So what can we use this model for? This model can help us to understand some of those basic questions. For example, that with a growing population, to meet the demand, how many more additional PRU officers will need if we want to maintain the same level of service? The same level of service here, meaning that if we want to keep our response time the same, at the current level, like right now we're about 17 minutes. If we want to keep the same kind of response time, and how many more officers will need. And so if we look at our high priority 911 calls, and we know that from year to date, from 2023 to this year, it's increased by about 3.1%. And this is actually second year in a row that we have seen over 3% growth for the high priority call. And this growth is generally consistent with the population growth we see in the city of Toronto. And if for the next year, in 2025, if the high priority call volume will increase by another 3%, the model will project that we will need about 50 additional, which is a net increase in the primary response officers. So this is just simply to keep meeting the demands of the growing population.
So I think a couple points to highlight just in terms of this slide and the one we saw before with the model itself. So what we were able to identify in the application and the model development essentially is that using 2023 data to build the model as 2024 information became live and we were able to understand the demand that was occurring in real time, we validated that it was actually quite accurate relative to what was happening in Toronto throughout the course of this year. And so it validates and provides us with a fair amount of comfort as we apply these to a number of scenarios moving forward. And then in terms of looking at scenarios like this use case as one example, we can expect some level of increase, of course, in population in Toronto. It will see what that is as we move forward, of course. And with that, we do expect to see additional calls for service as a result. This helps us to calibrate that expectation given current demands and what we understand. This, of course, is very specific to primary response unit constables, police constables, because they're the ones that are based on this data and attending these calls and spending the time on these calls, which would then be able to address this increased demand. And so, of course, we would all understand that in addition to that, there's investigative work, there's support work by a number of units, forensic identification units, both civilians and uniform members, specialists in our property and evidence areas, disclosure requirements by all of our members, including some of our specialized teams. And so this would be in addition to this work. And as we move forward, I think it's really important to note that this is the first phase of this modeling. We've advanced beyond what other Canadian agencies are doing, and in many ways globally, this is leading work. And so as we progress it and we start to apply this to other areas of the service, it will bring in that picture as well and provide some of the planning support around this. So contextually, this is the first phase of this work, and we will continue to develop around this. And I'll pass it back to Leigh.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ian. Could you go to the next one? Thank you. So the second of the two models that Environics has built for us is the queuing model, and it applies queuing theory to our data to determine staffing levels required to meet customer service performance criteria, response times. TPS will use this model to assist with evaluating the root causes of increasing response times, and outputs for the model will assist the service and the board with setting time target goals by call priority, as was recommended by the Auditor General. With this model, the service will be able to analyze how changes in volume of work impact performance metrics such as pending time and probability all units are busy. This model has been built, and we're going to begin testing in early December. So we're forecasting that we'll begin executing the model populated with 2024 data and insights in Q1 2025. So as Ian mentioned, outputs from both models will become inputs into our workforce planning and budget development programs. These models will serve as one component of our planning processes. They'll augment decision-making, and they're useful support to other analytics products and decision-making frameworks that we have and will be building out. Employing these two staffing analysis models will provide tools to allow the TPS and the board to complete the steps in decision-making required to implement recommendations 6 and 8 of the Auditor General's Calls for Service report. And something very important to note, we've created these models in partnership with the Toronto Police Association, so we're equal partners in this. And that will help us to support alignment on our shared data sets. It's going to ensure alignment, so we're both working from the same sets of data and we're able to kind of provide the same numbers. So once we've had an opportunity to use both of the models and through 2025, we'll have a better understanding of how they will interrelate and augment our existing data points and related programs.
So just to maybe close out this section, what this effectively will give us, and it's not all there yet, there's a first model that we talked about that effectively says, hold all things the same and just have one variable that's changing. So in our case, calls for service. So what it's trying to do is isolate simply either population or calls for service to say if everything else held the same, if your response time's the same and your time on call is the same and you haven't been able to kind of do anything else, what would just the incremental impact of every % be on the PCs only. So that does not include your investigative area or the sergeants or any other sort of infrastructure on top of that. So that, I would say, is really kind of just a macro model that will help inform reasonableness and deployment at a high level in terms of, you know, during budget processes and during kind of a big planning process. The second model, which is still in development, is really around, okay, if today your average response time is X and you want to reduce it by 5 minutes, what does that mean in terms of the incremental impact of officers? And so what that will help us do is actually go down to a local divisional level and allow us to, as best as possible, calibrate response times at a more divisional deployment level. But again, that one, you know, the part that organizationally we will always have to balance is that is deployment specifically to priority response. We have a hiring plan that we're certainly trying to hire to. And how do net new officers then get reallocated to all the other priorities, like the investigative areas, to balance that? So I think those are the pieces that are still the work in progress, and certainly the work with the TPA and the governance around the numbers and the ability for an organization to deploy based on the most critical and pressing needs. You know, that ability will be retained with some level of governance and information sharing with the TPA. And so that concludes sort of an update on where that modeling is going. I'm now going to
Sorry,
Yeah.
we're supposed to be waiting till the end, but I have to interject because the purpose of doing the presentation first and then the deputations is so we're all on the same page. And I gotta be honest with you, we can't be on the same page because I do not yet understand what this is telling me. My test for a chart is, having heard the presentation, could I now present this chart to someone? I couldn't in a million years.
so which
I'm
happy to-
not
we're
clear
happy
what
to
the
go back
workload
to-
performance model is actually telling me.
So
I don't
the-
even know what detractor hours are.
So
I
the
do
work-
not know what any of that means.
Yeah, so certainly there is going
Let's
to
all
have.
be on the same page.
Yes, so certainly there's going to have to be a deep dive on what are all the variables that are available to us as an organization to influence what the number ultimately is. Know that this is just a tool
What the number of what?
of PCs that we need to deploy to
Oh,
the front
okay,
line.
right.
Right? And so different things will influence that number. The calls for service coming in, the time on call, the number of officers that might be off at any one time, which is what detractors could mean. The amount of time we want to allocate towards admin, paperwork, you know, filling out use of force forms versus going from call to call. So all of that needs to be built in to a number of inputs and variables that will ultimately influence what this suggests the deployment number should be. And so all we're saying for today is, this is not, we're not using this right now to inform what our deployment is, but we're reasonably comfortable that the model has incorporated the right number of variables that you can slide up and down and adjust to eventually help in that planning process.
Okay. But when it comes back, it will tell us what all those factors are. So we can
Yes,
really
I
see
think
what we're
there,
looking at.
certainly at a different meeting, maybe it's through, because it's quite technical, I think it's more of a deep dive. That wasn't really the intent for today.
Okay.
But I think in terms of what the board needs to be comforted by is the model is going through a lot of validation. It is mimicking our current performance of where we're at and showing similar numbers, which is what we would expect. And there is an ability for us to have flexibility on how these different variables influence the number. And so all of that, though, in terms of how it gets presented to the board and so that you have a sense of how this will inform deployment, you know, the suggestion, I would suggest that that's something we do in the new year because it's not actually in practice yet.
Okay.
Does that help?
Okay, I'll wait then.
Okay. And so the other update is really around our public engagement. Public engagement is a key part of our budget development process. These meetings are a big part of that process. But on top of these meetings and on top of what the city's efforts are, which are also quite extensive, we conduct a telephone survey, and we do this every year. And so I'm going to turn it to Winsome Speck, who I believe is online. She's a senior research director for Forum Research, as well as Jessica Simpson, who's an analyst, to actually walk through what this year's findings were.
Can everyone hear me virtually okay? Okay, thanks so much for having us. So before we get into a little bit more of a deep dive into the results, I know it's important to understand who we actually talked to and how we contacted them. So a little bit about some methodological considerations. What we did this past summer, so at a specific point in time, we conducted a random digit dial survey to understand your residents' perceptions related to police services. And we use random digit dialing because it's a probability-based sampling technique, meaning that every resident within the city of Toronto had an equal chance or opportunity of being selected to complete the survey. It's still considered one of the golden standards of conducting research today. So once we connected to someone through the telephone, they did then have the opportunity to continue the survey through the telephone if they preferred, or continue it online. And the online survey was also available in 5 languages, so not only English, but French, simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, and Punjabi, just to ensure the inclusivity of the Toronto's diverse population. There was also screening criteria set in place to ensure that they were in fact a Toronto resident, to ensure they were an adult, i.e. 18 years of age or older, and were not a member of either the Toronto Police Service or some other police service. So when all was said and done, what we ended up achieving was just over 1,500 survey completes overall, which gives us a margin of error of about plus or minus 2.5%, meaning that if we were to conduct this study again, the results would be consistent to that degree 95% of the time, or 19 times out of 20. And although probability-based research tends to closely match the distribution of your population demographics, we also weighted the data on age and gender just to ensure that your sample size of 1,500 respondents closely reflected your city's demographics in accordance to 2021 census data. So all that being said, what did we find? Some key things to highlight is 9 out of 10 respondents, they expressed some level of concern with your response time for officers attending to higher priority calls, 49% being very or extremely concerned. So your current response time at the time of the survey was 18 minutes, but it was decreased from last year, which is 22 minutes. So there is a slight decrease in people being concerned with this because your time has also decreased compared to last year. We also found that 92% of respondents show some level of concern that 90% of 911 calls are not answered within 15 seconds, with nearly 6 in 10 being very or extremely concerned. And this is for any call. 85% indicated that it's important to have a neighborhood community offer assigned to their community, with 51% saying it is very or extremely important. You did increase your police neighborhood community officer presence by 4 communities this year, just to note that. And about 9 in 10 indicate that it is important for them to be able to report some lower priority crimes online, but also they want you to continue responding to some of these lower priority calls, with the most common ones or the most important ones for you to respond to being unwanted guests, checking in on disputes, and checking the well-being of your residents when prompted. Okay. We also asked respondents that to help you set priorities in 6 areas over the next year. We wanted to know if levels of service should increase, decrease, or stay the same, i.e. maintain. keeping in mind that there could be budget implications when increasing. And what we found is that the top three that they want you to increase service levels in are response and patrol, investigations and victim support, and crime prevention. And to maintain or keep the current status quo of service levels to courts and prisoner management, events and protests, and traffic and parking enforcement. I'll hand it back over.
Thank you. And so how this translates to for us is it does partially inform our priorities around having greater frontline support to address response times, investigative capacity, keep Toronto traffic, and keep the city moving. We will continue to focus on improved evidence management and disclosure compliance. This year, we talked quite a bit about promotional processes and augmenting our supervision and the need for that, given our younger and younger workforce. We are still and we remain very committed towards partnership and alternative service delivery and call diversion. We will absolutely continue police reform and have create some capacity through technology and digital enablement. And so this really brings us to the actual budget itself. At the last budget committee, I talked about, the many big buckets that effectively inform and influence what our budget will come in at. Staffing is obviously one part of it, but there's also, a lot of the bridging strategies and work we're doing to support and tuck under the city's long-term financial plan. Reserves is a significant component, especially as you have aging equipment and more and newer equipment that ultimately will one day need to be replaced. Enhancements to programs, notably the CSPA and our collective agreements and other contractual increases like statutory benefits and WSIB. And then there's a small component of revenue, whether that's grants or admin fees. And so what you'll see next week in terms of, and a significant amount of work has gone into every single one of these budgets to absolutely minimize what our ask will be. And so what you will see next week is there's really 4 or 5 things that lead to our budget increase. One is the hiring plan. The other one is the annualized impacts of the 2024 hiring plan on the sworn and civilian side. There is an increase around statutory deductions and benefits that's tied to the hiring plan, but that's also tied to an aging. On one side, we have a quarter that are less than 5 years, but on the other side, we have an increasing number of retirements and at an age where certainly the demand for benefits would be higher. You will also see a line around kind of some of our inflationary contractual changes that are already baked into many of the approvals that would have come into the board from a procurement standpoint, and a lot of that, frankly, will end up being tied to a number of our IT investments. Those really are the main buckets of increases that you will see next week. Many, many line items, including premium pay and a lot of the non-salary, have either been flatlined or been reduced further in order to make room for enhancements in other areas. So CSPA is a good example. We are doing what we can to absorb many of the impacts related to the Community Safety and Policing Act. Our ability to do that, the way we've managed to do that is in part, some of it's in capital, but some of it is by cutting back on other expenses or taking them beyond reducing them beyond their 2024 budget. So all of this you will see in the coming days, and certainly at the December 12th meeting, that presentation will primarily be focused on the actual budget itself. Moving along to capital, we will spend some time on 5455. What you'll see in the capital plan, it has seen our 10-year capital plan certainly has seen an increase. The most notable one is 5455 and revising the cost estimates and the direction on that. You will also see cost increases that are directly tied to the multi-year hiring plan around technology, new equipment, the number of cars that we're projecting over the next 10 years. Tied to that, you will also see some state of good repair that needs to happen, in part to accommodate more people, but also because there's legitimate, health and safety considerations that just buildings and aging infrastructure that needs to be taken care of. And you will see the continuation of our 41 division build as well as NG 911. So I'm gonna pass, or actually before I pass it on, the thing to know around the budget is it's certainly not without risks. We have aligned with city staff. Our finance team and the city finance team have worked incredibly well to align at a number that balances affordability, attempts to balance risk, and also recognize that we have to deliver and adequate and effective service delivery. I will say there are a number of risks, and we'll talk about them in the board report. We talk about them now. It is around, so premium pay is one. It is a historically underfunded account. We are not asking for new premium pay dollars, save for except I think the traffic direction program, which has a direct offset in terms of cost recovery from the city. This, as we staff up, we are taking a hard look at premium pay. We do expect to curb some of it just through staffing up, maybe a little bit less callbacks. We are also looking at things like court time and what is eligible activities under this area in order to, put some tighter rigor around it. While early days, we have seen a modest decrease just in the last couple months, just through some of these management actions, and so we will be continuing that into the new year. The one-time funding with the city, so we're all under we're all aligned on this one in the sense that there's a new Ontario deal that certainly this budget partially relies on, just like with the city. There's bridging actions. This is part of a long-term financial plan with the city, and so as different things come online, or if other things are taken away from our budget in terms of reserve contributions, this is just one we need to continue working with the city on. Benefits, we have put an increase in for statutory deductions and benefits. The question is, did we put enough? And we won't know until the actuals come in terms of how those trend. Similar with CSPA, we have factored in impacts of CSPA, but given that the legislation is so new, the question is, have we looked around all the corners to see all the impacts? That will remain to be seen as we get more and more into implementing the CSPA and seeing what those impacts will be. And then the last one's really around our hiring pace. We're very effective at hiring right now. We have an excellent talent acquisition team and a very good recruitment team. But we have built in a 4% gapping rate, which is a little bit higher than is normal for organizations. Typically, most will build in about 2.5 to 3. So for us, pacing out our hiring very deliberately, carefully, will be key in order to always have some vacancy room without compromising, critical priorities and operations. And so in terms of, what do we want to achieve from this budget, it really does come down to a few things. We want to address the response time. We want to improve upon case closure rates. We want to continue doing referrals and look at NCO expansion and continue our prevention work. We must continue preparing for FIFA and have capacity to address events and unplanned protests and demonstrations, and keep the city moving, whether that's through enforcement, deterrence, or technology. And we need to obviously support the court system and evidence disclosure. Internally, what it means for us is continuing reform, continuing modernization, continuing capacity building projects, and driving greater digital enablement to simplify work and communicate and access, services differently. So I'm going to turn it over now to Acting Manager Doug Giles to provide a bit of an update on 5455, as this is probably the most notable change in our capital plan and we have built-in revised estimates. So we probably wouldn't have as much time on board day to go through this, so we figured this is kind of the right forum to provide a bit more of an update.
Good afternoon. I'll just advance this, hopefully. So just to set the scene, in 1994, both the 54 Division and 55 Division stations were identified as priorities for replacement. That was a full 30 years ago. In 2017, the board adopted the Way Forward as a services business plan, which recommended a amalgamation of the two divisions. In 2018, City Council approved the Danforth Garage site for this amalgamated station development. And in 2020, $39 million was approved in the budget for this. In 2021, the design started. The complication was the service paused the project in the spring of 2022 because of three reasons. One, a preliminary cost estimate greatly exceeded the available budget of $39 million. The small Danforth Garage site within a larger redevelopment by Creatio presented extra challenges and extra costs. And as well, Creatio had no suitable alternate site. And then thirdly, it was understood that maintaining two geographically separate stations might actually improve service and better serve the future, and especially in terms of future growth. So this suggested de-amalgamating. So we have a recommendation which is based on three assumptions. One, that there are operational benefits to de-amalgamating, either now or in the future, or particularly in the future. Secondly, that we're able to maintain workplaces for all the members during the construction of these two facilities. And thirdly, that the cost and schedule is acceptable. And our understanding is that these are reasonable assumptions. So our recommendation is that the service functionally de-amalgamate the currently amalgamated 55 Division once the two separate stations are available. Secondly, that we proceed first with design and construction of the first facility, which would be at the 54 Division site at 41 Cranfield. Secondly, we would proceed with design and construction of the second station at the existing 55 Division site once that project was funded. So at the end of this exercise, we would be delivering two brand new stations of about 55,000 square feet, each with 180 parking spaces, and the specifics would be further refined with the design working group and steering committee. So just as a reminder, these are site plans. The first one in gray shows the existing 54 Division building on its site, and the two sketches below. The blue one shows the size of a new facility with some surface parking, and beside it is a underground, one level of underground parking. Similarly, for the 55 Division site, the top gray image is the existing facility. The blue image is a brand new facility, and again, one level of underground parking underneath that. So, when we were looking for sites to build on, and again, the important thing is that we are able to maintain a workplace for the members during this construction. As I say, our recommendation is to build first on the 54 Division site, and we would use this once built as a temporary home for 55 Division staff to move into while their site was raised and it was rebuilt. Other options we had looked at was trying to build on the two sites at the same time. However, the issue there is how do you find temporary workplaces for 390 members and an even larger number of cars? We did look whether there was a third site that could be used. However, our discussions with the city revealed that there was no suitable city-owned site available. and that looking to find a privately owned site is both expensive to buy and or very difficult to acquire. So the issue was if the 54 Division facility is going to be the first site that we're going to raise and rebuild on, where do we house those staff? As I mentioned, there's about 128 members in their cars. There's both some 55 division officers there, as well as some guest units such as our prime unit, traffic unit, and vehicles involved in crime. So our options we are presenting would be, and this is not something that would be required until 2027 or 28, is there's some excess, well, there is some space in the new 41 division that will be completed by that time because it was built for some future growth and capacity. The 42 division is also an option, and 43 division is also an option. And for vehicles involved in crime, we're looking at the 3 Dome Avenue site, which is a city-owned site, which has a lot of service parking, and possibly 3301 Markham. So this schedule, the top cluster shown in green, that's the 54 division. So that would be the first one to go through design in blue, approvals proceeding in parallel, tender, and then construction. So that would take us to about 2030. During the construction period, we would also be designing the new station for 55, so that once the 41 Cranfield facility was complete, the 55 division officers could be moved up there, and then the 55 division site could be raised and it could be redeveloped so that we would have 2 completed stations by approximately 2034, subject to budget approval.
No, give me the thing.
Oh, sorry.
So I think the thing to know on the schedule is certainly we are looking at options to try to bring this in because this is quite a long time. So the question's going to come down to swing space, and there are other options that would probably need to be looked at. Certainly East York has always been a question around availability and timing of space. And so this right now assumes that any swing space, you have to kind of solve for yourself internally. That's not to say through modern TO, we can't figure something else out in order to compress the timeline, which is very much the desire from the chief, from the command, in particular because this project has been now a couple years paused already. I think the important thing to know for where we're at right now is we do want to solidify on the requirement for 2 separate sites, kind of close the conversation in a way that there truly is, after an exhaustive search and certainly a lot of discussion with Create TO, there simply isn't land to kind of accommodate, 2 divisions plus cars at the sort of size that you would need within a very constrained geographical area and not compromise, response time and still deal with a city that is growing. And so we certainly are looking to proceed to the design phase. And if during that phase is where we would look at opportunities to compress the schedule, revise the costs, and look at different options around swing space and things like that. So I'm gonna actually go straight to conclusion now, just because I know we have deputations and questions coming up as well. And so that concludes really the main updates for this 3rd budget committee.
Thank you, Deputy Dhaliwal. And before we go on to questions and comments, we do have 2 deputants, the first being Nicole Corrado. She provided a written submission, and Ms. Corrado is here by virtually. So can you hear us, Ms. Corrado?
Yes.
All right, just if you're ready to start, please go ahead.
Yeah. Two things. One, I was going to say is that the police really need to retire the mounted unit. A recent TikTok video and Instagram video of the police horses at the Taylor Swift concert, they looked really uncomfortable, according to Animal Justice. And there's actually no need for a mounted unit anymore. All of that can be done with bicycles, drones, and and the horses really should be retired to a sanctuary. The other thing is that we also need to be looking at reducing the use of dogs, because dogs often are used for dangerous things that like searching suspects and sniffing for drugs, and those tasks should be detasked to using robotics and other technology. Certainly, these animals don't consent to this dangerous work. The horses should be retired immediately and the dogs phased out, except for, safe search and rescue uh, things. The other thing I was going to say is more personal. What I recently had, uh, wellness checks, like person in crisis wellness checks with police, and those calls could have far more efficiently been done with paramedics alone or with a community crisis program. I'm on the autism spectrum. Sometimes they get panicked or overwhelmed or have meltdowns, and police have been called, but it would be much better to have a non-police presence, because police, even though I would have to say the officers who handled the situation the other day were absolutely wonderful. They were exemplary, but it's still very intimidating when you have armed police come, and you often think, what have I done wrong? And even if you've done nothing wrong, you often think, what have I done wrong? And you start panicking. Like it doesn't calm me down. But so the budget would be, I noticed that there was more money being put into, say, mental health stuff. That needs to be diverted to the community crisis program. I think diverting the mobile crisis intervention team, some of that budget could be better allocated to having the non-police community crisis intervention program, expand that to a 24/7 citywide permanent program. That would be really, really, really great. And improving the 2-on-1 service so that it isn't, for this service, press one, for that service, press two, but actually have 2-on-1, talk to an operator right away. That would make it much easier. And also having 2-on-1 that you can text on your phone, or that you could even text or email through or access through an app, so that a person who uses an augmented and alternative method of communication, or a person who is using sign language, can easily access the 2-on-1 service as well as the 911 service. That's pretty much what I was going to say.
Thank you. Appreciate your written submission as well, Ms. Corrado. Are there any questions for Ms. Corrado? No. All right. Thank you, Ms. Corrado. At this point, we'll move on to our next deputant on item number 1, and that's Mr. Langenfeld. Okay. He's not on mine. Sure. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And I noticed that Derek's here as well to give a presentation, right? So he was registered before me, so.
I don't have him, but I will have him after you, Mr. Langenfeld, and happy to hear from Mr. Moore.
He CC'd me on the email where it confirmed that he was registered. Anyways, so I'm sharing my screen here. So the first thing here is just I noticed at last month's meeting, the hiring plan and this question of what the agenda actually said and what the legislation requires must be disclosed in agendas ahead of time is what's going to be dealt with. And the multi-year hiring plan, the only proposal was that we were going to get an update from the chief to allow further discussion. And yet I've heard it seems like the new, this new term of COP to POP plus that was created for the last session seems to have been approved. So that's not quite clear where we're going with the hiring plan. Meanwhile, looking at what the services come up here in their presentation, I go back to the 2014 operating budget request, and at that point we had 5,600 uniformed officers and 2,000 plus civilians authorized. which put us at around 275 cop-to-pop ratio when we took into account both civilians and uniform officers. Now, when we look at the current figures and what was in the 2023 annual report here from last month's agenda item, we've got 8,500 police total. That gives us a cop-to-pop ratio of 307 police based on 2021 census population figures. And even if we use the inflated numbers here that the Toronto Police have in their budget figures, we're still looking at currently the number based on 2023 figures. We had between 269 and 285 cops per 100,000 people in this city. Basically what happened is we replaced a number of uniformed officers with civilians, but that was always part of the plan. Going back here to the 2014 operating budget, the whole point, what they brought up was that we were taking 99 uniformed officers in that year and switching those over to 99 civilian positions. And that's what we've been doing since 2010, and that's why the number of uniformed officers has dropped and the number of civilian officers has increased dramatically. We know in addition to those numbers, we also have 209 TTC special constables. We have 38 traffic agent special constables. We have 168 TCHC special constables and 48 U of T special constables. So in reality, we've got right now, based on the numbers, roughly 8,600 Toronto Police employees. Add in all those other special constables that aren't under the Toronto Police budget, and we're over 9,000 law enforcement in Toronto. And that works out to 302 law enforcement personnel per 100,000 residents. That's based on a 3 million population estimate for Toronto. And of course, when we look at these numbers that the service uses, when they compare other cities, they use census figures populations. But when they compare it for Toronto, they use made up, inflated numbers that the city uses to include people that aren't actually counted in the census. Now, meanwhile, in the 54 division, 54-55 division amalgamation, basically this proposal comes up to increasing the number of hired police officers by 41 members per year by increasing this. So that's basically over $5 million a year in costs that adds every year just in staffing. As well, in their estimate here, they use a 3.5% inflation rate. Of course, we know that the Bank of Canada is going to keep that at 2%. That's their goal, always has been, and in fact, right now it's less than that. So that brings these numbers way down. Ultimately, we end up with somewhere between $10 and $50 million more cost based on their numbers to come up with two separate places rather than one. And in fact, it's costing us $4 to $5 million a year, plus benefits and everything else for these 41 extra officers. So we're looking at not only is it $10 to $50 million more to create two buildings, but it's going to cost us $5 million a year more in employee wages. And there's no justification for that. The police were the ones who came up with the recommendation in the way forward to actually amalgamate these two divisions and to eliminate one of these places so that we could have 41 less staff. But in fact, that's not what we came up with. So I wonder if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Langenfeld. Any questions of Mr. Langenfeld?
I'll be asking staff.
Thank you.
Mr. Moore, I just want to bring to the attention, I think everyone is concerned because they're not going to get a chance to speak. I actually have you signed up for item 2. There are 10 folks signed up for item 2, which is again the Toronto Police Service Board operating budget request. So I take it everybody's here to speak on the budget. So if you could just wait. We've got 2 folks who, Ms. Corrado and Mr. Langenfeld. Councillor Carroll has some questions, and then we will go to item number 2, and everyone who has signed up can speak. So I think that'll be the proper order, or some.
Can I suggest that we poll registered deputants? Did they want to speak to the police budget or the little $2 million board budget? Because I rather think that people made an error in registration. Knowing what I know about the faces that I see in the gallery, I think they wanted to speak to the $2 billion budget, not the $2 million budget. I'm pretty sure of it. So why don't we, or 1 point whatever, why don't we poll them and find out what it is they wanted to speak to?
I don't care, I just want to speak.
Same except Mr. Moore.
All right, so before we receive item number 1, and everybody will be allowed to speak on whether or not it's actually the board budget, no one is going to get left out. So as long as people are happy with that, I think we'll sort of keep to the...
Well, what we usually, the reason we have a presentation, then we have the deputations, is then later when I'm asking questions of staff, I can include questions that they have raised if they're meaningful questions. But if we don't hear from them now, I won't be including those in my questions of staff. So maybe we want to find out who wants to speak to the whole budget and hear from them, and then I can ask their questions if they're good questions.
All right. All right. You know, what we can do is, because this meeting clearly is about the budget, and there are different aspects of the budget, what we will do now is, before Councillor Carroll either has questions of the presentation team or of the deputants, we'll go next. And I have an order, if Derek, you'll indulge me. And the next deputant is Mr. Taub, Matthew Taub. So everyone's going to get heard.
Yeah, that's a good.
This is on? Perfect. All right, members of the Toronto Police Services Board, thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Matthew Taub, and I am a concerned member of Toronto's Jewish community. I come before you to highlight the troubling rise of hate in our city and propose actionable steps for addressing it through the police services budget. The statistics are alarming. Hate crimes in Toronto have increased by 47% from 2022 to 2023, with 365 incidents reported just last year. The Jewish community continues to be disproportionately targeted, experiencing 135 anti-Semitic occurrences just in 2023, more than double the prior year. Since October 7th, 2023, the trend has escalated further with a 75% surge in anti-Semitic incidents. These crimes include vandalism, physical assault, and public calls for violence, acts that undermine the safety and dignity of an entire community. Now, numbers matter. Where there has been an increase in hate-related crimes targeting Jews and the Muslim community, an alarming rise for the Muslim community of 140%, from 13 to 31 incidents. The impact of anti-Semitic hate crimes cannot be minimized. For the Jewish community, the increase of 75% represents 84 incidents in 2022 and 146 in 2023. The stark difference underscores the urgent need for appropriate prioritization and action. To date, the numbers for 2024, we already know, are significantly higher. The recent protests at Bathurst and Shepherd are emblematic of the systemic issues we have. It is deeply troubling that an inspector was recorded stating, "You're inciting them because of your presence." Jews were inciting the pro-terror supporters simply by being present at a rally in their own community. He then followed up with the reasoning, incitement of Jews because they don't like you. This statement is not only offensive, but indicative of a misunderstanding of the basic dynamics of hate crimes. Furthermore, the inspector's lack of awareness regarding the IRGC's designation as a terrorist organization, despite the display of its flag, demonstrates a critical gap in police training and knowledge. TPS is currently ill-equipped to respond effectively to the surge of hate crimes. The 2023 Hate Crime Statistical Report notes resources limited, insufficient specialized training, and outdated community engagement strategies. Officers lack real-time information and are inadequately prepared to enforce hate crime laws effectively. This is unsustainable given the rising threats. To address the challenges, I urge the board to prioritize the following measures in its budget considerations: embedding the Crown in hate crime operations, assign Crown attorneys to work directly with the hate crimes unit to streamline case preparation and ensure that hate-motivated offenses are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Mandatory IRA-based training for all officers. Equip all officers with the tools to identify and respond to anti-Semitism effectively. Following the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, officers must differentiate between legitimate political expression and hate-driven incitement. Strengthening the hate crime enforcement. Ensure police enforce hate crime laws decisively. Clear directives must mandate immediate intervention when protests or other activities cross into incitement or criminal behavior. Proactive hate crime response. Deploy hate crime officers on site at protests to monitor and intervene as necessary. Officers must be equipped with daily briefs on relevant laws and community sensitivities to stay up to date. Enhance protest management. Protests involving harassment, incitement, or the display of terrorist symbols, such as an IRGC flag or an inverted red triangle, must be met with immediate enforcement of criminal laws, including those concerning unlawful assembly and harassment. Enforce existing laws against the use of face coverings in protests where anonymity is used to incite or commit illegal activities, wearing balaclavas, keffiyehs wrapped around their heads, not their necks, or other masks when there is reasonable suspicion that they are being used to avoid identification while engaging in unlawful conduct. Community liaison officers. Allocating more resources for liaison officers embedded in the divisions, not randomly throughout the city. These officers must foster trust and provide more real-time communications during crisis. A comprehensive police education retraining. Ensure all officers receive ongoing education and daily briefings to remain informed of changes to laws and the current social and political landscape. And lastly, civil expertise in hate crime analysis. Expand the hate crimes unit to include civilian and analysts specializing in community outreach, data analysis, and public education. These roles can strengthen the police response to hate incidents. So let me finish up in 10 seconds here. Now, the failure to act decisively today and moving forward by adding these extra roles in the budget embolden hate tomorrow. The 2023 Hate Crime Statistical Report highlights the broader societal impact of hate crimes. They harm not just individuals, but entire communities. Effective policing, supported by an adequately resourced budget, is essential to maintaining the trust and safety of all Torontonians. This is not merely a Jewish issue, it's a Toronto issue, and every resident deserves to feel safe, and that safety begins with the police service empowered to act against hate. And I urge the board to adopt these recommendations and allocate the necessary budget in the upcoming year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Todd. Any questions? Councilor Kerr?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I just wanted I don't want you to go away with the wrong idea. I'm wondering if you're aware, with respect to budget, we can't actually move down to that level of specificity, inserting very specific roles. We develop policy,
Right.
and provide funding, but basically we can ask the chief if he's resourced enough to do those things. Some that you've mentioned
Exactly, and
are
that's what-
actually happening.
And just by having them,
But-
they have
but
to be
you
read into the
understand
record so that we know. Yes,
That's more the nature of the questions that we can ask here in the budget subcommittee.
for sure. But knowing that those
Okay.
resources can be allocated towards more retraining and education, and just know that it's there. So it's
Yeah,
being able to service those areas, which, listen, a daily briefing that goes out in an email costs money.
Right, right.
You have to have a staff member to put it together. It takes time to do it. So all these are budget resources that have to be allocated towards it. So
Right, I just wanted to make sure that you didn't go away hurt if we don't move those specifically, because we have to walk the fine line of
100%.
funding and developing policy, but not directly deciding how the chief will police.
For sure. No, not policing, but a lot of the education
Yeah.
behind it. And
Yeah,
what we're seeing on the streets is that a lot of officers are not informed enough. You've got specific off to the side who you might talk to, but not, and as we saw just on the weekend, not knowing that the most recent thing that was made to a terrorist organization recognized here in Canada, the IRGC, not knowing, hey, listen, I'll be honest with you, not many people know what the flag looks like, but not knowing that it was is an issue. So that education component needs to be ongoing with most organizations and most companies, and I'm sure the TPS does it as well, but needs to be more inclusive of knowing what is happening and what's changing in real time, so they have that information in real time.
Right, right.
So-
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Taub. Not seeing any other questions. Item, or deputant number 2 is Daniel Tate. Mr. Tate? Is Mr. Tate online virtually? Oh, there he is. Good afternoon, Mr. Tate. You just popped in and out. Well, perhaps what we can do is move on to, and then when Mr. Tate comes back, we will give him a chance to debut. So the third person is Ms. Talia Klein-Layton. Ms. Layton?
I almost feel like I should just say whatever Matthew said, ditto. But members of the Toronto Police Services Board, thank you for enabling me to appear before you at this very critical time. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that we are one firecracker away from riots and violence in our streets, and I think we all know what is fueling this race to radicalism. My name is Talia Klein-Layton, and I'm the president of the Canadian Women Against Anti-Semitism. We're also known by the anti-Semites in this town as the Nazis in pink jackets, or according to protesters at a Toronto University campus, I'm a Zionist whore. I'm a child abuser for having Zionist babies, and of course, I'm a rich Jewish bitch. I've also been told at protests that I ought to be raped. While this is hate speech enough, as I said, we are one firecracker away from speech becoming physical violence, and I fear for the safety of my children, myself, my community, and my city. And actually, let me backtrack for just a moment, because we're currently in a city that has already seen, under the rubric of anti-Semitism, arson attacks, a Jewish day school has been shot at twice, vandalism and graffiti that runs rampant, and students on campuses have been harassed and forced to come face to face with bona fide members of terrorist organizations, including Sami Doon, PFLP, the IRGC, and of course Hamas, and not to mention their hordes of useful idiots dressed up as terrorist cosplayers, spreading propaganda and rhetoric of a most hateful and violent nature. We are one firecracker away from death to Israel and death to Canada being played out on our streets. This globalized intifada, this anti-democratic, anarchic wave of destruction is manifest here in Toronto as lawlessness and a flouting of the criminal code and common decency on our streets. Speaking for the women of the CWAA, we are also deeply concerned with the misogyny that is habitually paired with anti-Semitism when directed toward women, as per my introduction. The hate goes beyond our faith, our nationality, our ethnicity, and invades our bodies, our sexuality, and bears the breadth of our intersectional identities. Every banner and slogan proclaiming by any means necessary and rape is resistance is a call to violence. We are one firecracker away from this rhetoric becoming rape and slogans becoming swarmings in our streets. And with all due respect to the Toronto Police Services, and I mean respect, because while the work that the men and women of our police services do every day to protect our community is truly extraordinary, and as a Jewish person who lives in this city, I am truly grateful every day. I live right down the street from where there's a mobile police services van. But it's not working. The dire circumstance we find ourselves in today has been marching down our streets for over a year now and has managed to move from death to Zionists, to death to Jews, to death to democracy, to death to Canada. And this global intifada has progressed through these stages, and the lawlessness, The repeated criminal code violations have gone unchecked. The global intifada in Toronto is feeling emboldened, permitted, and is expanding rapidly. The big question is, how have we gotten to a situation where Toronto is one firecracker away from falling into further chaos? Nobody's buying the charter excuses that are dragged out by many that we've elected to office and even those appointed to positions of authority. Charter rights are not absolute and must be placed in balance to each other. Freedom to assemble and freedom of speech must be balanced against freedom from hate and freedom from harassment. And I call it an excuse because, in my opinion, there is a lack of political will to crack down against an ideology that has infiltrated our municipality, our legislature, certainly our school boards and universities. And so we must look to our police, to law enforcement, to protect our city while our leaders do nothing except maybe dance and play dress up. And it is my considered opinion, after speaking to members of police services and various officials, that Toronto Police have been forced into a situation where there are just not enough police officers. There are not enough boots on the ground, and these few officers cannot be expected to protect themselves, keep the peace, and enforce the law at the same time. Law enforcement is taking a backseat to safety due to a lack of resources and a lack of training in issues of hate, racism, and anti-Semitism. This policy is unsustainable and is clearly failing. There are a myriad of laws not currently being enforced, including unlawful assembly, wearing a mask while engaging in unlawful assembly, disturbing the peace, incitement to violence, vandalism, harassment, intimidation, threatening, and of course, the willful promotion of hate. In short, and I'm almost done, we need more boots on the ground, and these officers must be trained in crowd control and dealing with hate-related crimes. I call on the Toronto Police Services Board to adopt the following recommendations. Number one, recognition that there is a fundamental existential threat facing Canada, Ontario, and Toronto that is anti-democratic, pro-terror, and pro-violence, and that is radicalizing within Canadian communities, especially among students. Number two, significantly more police officers dispatched to protests so that arrests can be made without fear for officer safety. Number three, expand the hate crimes unit and ensure that greater numbers are trained in dealing with radical ideology, terrorism, racism, and hate. Enhance patrols in Jewish neighborhoods to ensure that Jewish institutions are not continuing targets for vandals, arsonists, and protesters. It is imperative that we act now to address the rising tide of anti-Semitism and anti-democratic extremism. By taking decisive action and directing the necessary resources, we can create a safer and more inclusive city for all. I urge the Toronto Police Services Board to consider these recommendations seriously and implement them without delay. The future of our city and the safety of my children depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Layton. Are there any questions of Ms. Layton? Thank you. Thank you very much. The next deputant is Sean Mahar. Mr. Mahar. It's Meyer? Maher. He's coming forward.
I think everyone has their own version about how to say my name.
I know, and I apologize, Mr. Mahar.
In Montreal, they say meager. In Tipperary, they say mar. My name's Sean Maher. I work at the Change Lab, and we do public policy reform work. I've been before the board a few times. I was there a year ago when when Deputy Mayor Morley and Councillor Chang wisely asked the service to generate a multi-year hiring plan.
Called your name for the deputation, so you must have signed up.
Sorry? Can we stop my clock? Okay, should I just start, or?
Yes, please. It must be
Thanks.
some technology issue. Thank you.
Sure. A year ago, Deputy Mayor Morley and Councillor Chang wisely asked the service to generate a multi-year hiring plan. that looked into a variety of factors to determine how many officers we actually need. Last spring, the board passed that motion, and last summer, the board doubled down on that and specifically asked the chief to create a multi-year hiring plan that specifically takes into account diversion options so that we could include all of the factors in assessing what our needs were. Here we are in late fall, and we have essentially none of that. We have nothing that could be called a real business plan, and all that has been put on the table is a list of pressures and a cop to pop ratio. And what does cop to pop really tell us? Sadly, not very much. It is transparently, at very best, an inconclusive statistic. If you assume the chief's desired cop to pop ratio of 200 officers per 100,000 residents, we need a new officer every time the population grows by 500 people. That means if you open a 500-bed long-term care facility, you need a new officer. If there's a baby boom and you get 500 more children, you need a new officer. If you open a whole bunch of halfway houses and get 500 more hardened criminals, you need one new officer. If you have 500 more youth, you need one new officer. And if you open 200 youth programs to support those kids, you still need one new officer. It is just logically, transparently not enough to base decisions on. And the research agrees. Research shows that changes in income, in age, in education, and poverty have far more impact on crime rates and on the demand on police than simple population growth. It also shows that increasing community services have an impact on demand, so the board's request for a plan that includes diversion was a wise one. Lastly, experience shows that cop to pop is not a good measure. I'm happy to play several videotapes, one just from last week, of chiefs of police in major Ontario cities saying cop to pop is a poor tool, one calling it the snake oil of police statistics. No one who's serious about budgeting thinks cop to pop is enough to base a decision on. So unfortunately, we don't have enough data to tell us how many officers we need. But let's say, just for argument's sake, we do need more. The next question would be, how do we pay for them? One option is to ask the taxpayers to pony up again. That's what's on the table now, a 3.9% hike, which amounts to almost $50 million this year and next year. That adds to, that is the highest two-year funding increase in the city's history. It adds to $20 million last year and $50 million the year before that, making this the most expensive term of council for policing for taxpayers by almost a 20% margin. It's $170 million. That's between a 4 and 5% tax increase in a time of an affordability crisis. And do we need all of that new money? Toronto will add about 1,000 new officers over the course of this term of council. That should be enough to relieve scheduling challenges and bring down the $45 million overtime budget. That's an efficiency that would more than erase the need for tax increases to cover the new officers. But that's not on the table. What's proposed is flatlining that massive budget and then maybe doing something about it later, someday, perhaps. The TPS could put in place one officer cars at night that would free up 100 officers to reduce the overtime budget, but we continue to make minimal progress on that practice. We could free up more officers and cut deeper into overtime if the service used the massive investment in niche and computer-assisted dispatch to create bunching protocols that meant we don't send 5 cars to deal with a homeless person in an ATM, just to use an example that I have personally seen. None of these efficiencies are a condition of moving forward. We're asking the taxpayers to pony up, but we are not requiring the service to deliver the efficiencies first. That's what we expect from every other division, what the taxpayers expect. And if you look at what we hear from taxpayers, if you look at the budget consultations the city did, the request to constrain police budgets outweighed the requests to increase them by 3 to 1. The public is looking for efficiencies here, and they're not a condition of the changes being proposed.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Marr? Okay, thank you, sir. The next deputant is Giuseppe Scolari. I believe Mr. Scolari is online.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Just let us know
Okay.
when you want to go ahead. We'll start the clock. Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, yeah.
Scolari.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. You know, my focus will be the response times, something that I've experienced personally, having had some criminal activity at my home. And the response time at that time was around 24 minutes. I understand that it's down to 17 minutes now for priority one response times, but you know, what kind of budget is it going to take to cut those even further? 10 years ago, the response times were 7 to 8 minutes. I know we keep using all these terms like cop to pop, which they sound like great marketing terms, but I only care about reality of what happened to me and what happens to countless other people. It was 10 years ago, it was 7 to 8 minutes, right? What's the staffing and the budget for investigative capacity, for break and enters, home invasions? You know, I had people come into my home, and then there's tons of other issues like car theft, break and enters into cars in people's driveways where they don't even steal the car, they just break in to see what's in there. People in this city are extremely afraid, as we saw, and I think a study that was released yesterday by the city of Toronto, it might have been yesterday, I read it today, where fear for safety has risen exponentially in this city. You know, you keep talking about keeping response times the same. Response times are unacceptable, right? When you're someone that's being threatened or you're fearing for your life, you know, 1 minute seems like eternity. 17 minutes seems like the end of time. I think the plan should be to improve response times to a level that save people's sanity, where you're not afraid, where you think that a cop will come and help you quickly, as opposed to 20 minutes or 25 minutes or 15 minutes or 17 minutes. I mean, 5 minutes is too long, in my opinion. I understand you have budgetary restraints, but you know, almost half of the respondents of these surveys are concerned that the current response times to urgent priority calls for service needs to be higher than the current standard. You know, 3 in 5 respondents are concerned that the time to answer calls are not meeting the international standard. You know, you have 911 calls. 92% of respondents are concerned that TPS needs to learn for some of these other police forces like Peel Regional, which has a much quicker response time on 911. So I think, you know, the bottom line here is that we understand that it's very expensive to police, but my taxes went up 10%. And I noticed my services, you know, the day-to-day services, like in my area, they used to collect the leaves, and they don't collect leaves anymore. And that's fine. I can rake my own leaves, and I can put those leaves in a bag and put them on the curb. I'm happy to do that, as long as the police show up if I call them in a reasonably quick manner. And I understand that if I call them because somebody's having a party next door, they're not going to show up in 17 minutes, and I don't expect them to. They have to prioritize their calls. But I do expect the police to show up extremely quickly if someone is breaking into my house, and they are threatening my partner, and I can't really defend myself because I don't really know the letter of the law in terms of what I can do physically to defend myself. You know, I understand that if I'm being physically assaulted or my partner's being physically assaulted, that we have the right to defend ourselves, but I don't know to what degree, and that's frightening. So I rely on the police because they're the experts. They're the people that have been trained, and I think having the right amount of police so that the response times are under 10 minutes is something that the city of Toronto should strive for. And when I look at Peel region and I look at Halton region, the ones that are pretty close to us, I see that they seem to value the police more than the city of Toronto does. That might be my perception, but as they say, perception is reality. And I perceive that the city of Toronto, in terms of the funding and the budget and the hoops that everybody has to jump through to get the budget and the funding, doesn't seem to have the same level of respect for our cops that other areas do. And I find that disheartening. I find it sad, and I find it extremely concerning as someone whose taxes went up 10% and pays them on time every quarter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Scolari, Council Carroll has a question.
Yeah, Mr.
Hello.
Scolari, hi. I'm not sure if it was clear in the presentation, because we talked about the hiring model here, but we didn't show the models that we looked at in the summer, but we showed what's going on here, and then we talked about the model that's currently being developed. It's still in development, but what is happening in actual hires here is at the last minute in last year's budget, we did do the maximum training allocation. We are now proposing here, and I've said publicly that I mean it for 2 years, we're maximizing the provincial training allocation at the college so that we are not just hiring cop to pop here, we are hiring that plus, save and except if the rate of growth goes up even further at the city. We are trying very hard to catch up with the population growth, and as such, we're going to use every space available to us in the college this year. There was a big increase this year, and I've committed publicly in an announcement with the chief to doing that again next year. And so,
Well,
every person we can wedge in there,
that's good to
we're
hear.
wedging into the college and training and getting on the ground.
Well, that's, Counselor, that's great to hear. And the other thing maybe I would suggest is the fact that you said you stated this publicly, I would suggest that perhaps those at City Hall that have a bearing on this continue to voice that support publicly, because I think it's extremely important to quelling the fears of citizens like myself. So thank you.
Well, Mayor Chow actually did later the same day echo the comments and express her enthusiasm for it. So after the chief spoke and after our board meeting, Madam Chair, and so I'm anticipating a fairly smooth ride through council.
Thank you very much.
I'm using a crystal ball there, but I know that you've had some trauma, and so I wanted to make sure that you understood that was very much what's in the budget this year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scolari. Any other questions?
Thank you.
I don't know if Member Migliore is still on the line. Okay. Yes, where is he? We'll move on. Mr. Tate has now, we've overcome the technology problems. So if Mr. Tate's online, we're ready to proceed when you are.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, Mr. Tate. So when you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate the time and this opportunity. I just wanted to come here and just voice my support that it is really critical that in this day and age, we do everything within our power to ensure that our police service is equipped, supported, and funded appropriately for a city of our size and a city of our complexity. It's not easy being a police officer. It's certainly not easy being a police officer in this current environment. In these modern times, it's a very demanding, stressful job. Morale seems to, at least from what I've seen, not been at its highest these days. And so it's really important that we invest in our police forces, and not just pop to pop and hiring more. And certainly that is very important, but also making sure that we have the budget allocations to improve the culture within the Toronto Police Services, ensure that they have the moral support, the psychological support, everything that they need to have a good, sharp frame of mind and feel supported so they can go out there every day and do the tough work that we need them to do to keep us safe. They are an essential service. They are who we use our tax dollars to protect us. And it's just really important that we have a police service that has strong morale, that is patriotic about defending Toronto against criminals and people who want to make this a less safe city. And they have their work cut out for them in ways I've never seen before in my life living in this city. I mean, we all know over the last 13 months, there have been very hostile, very aggressive rallies happening all over the streets of Toronto. And those demand and consume a lot of police resources, often at a cost to other people who need those police during those times. We've seen P1 response times go up. And every time I pass by one of these rallies and I see so many police officers needed to contain them, I can't help but think to myself, how is somebody who's maybe out in Etobicoke or out in the West End and needs a police officer urgently, but they're going to have to wait because all these cops have to be, dealing with these incessant rallies that happen every weekend. Um, Me myself, I was walking downtown near one of these rallies, and I had an Israeli flag patch on my backpack, and I got swarmed by 3 or 4 people who started yelling obscenities at me, and I didn't know who to call because again, police response times are 18, 19, 20 minutes. And so I just wanted to come here and just say, I think it's super critical going into next year that the Toronto Police Service is adequately funded. We have a per capita police representation higher than we've had over the last few years. Get that cop to pop up and just invest in our police services so that our cops are feel that they have the support, their morale is boosted. We're hiring, fresh young cadets, and we're training them to be the best police officers they can be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tate. Are there any questions of Mr. Tate? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Tate. The next individual is Adam Cutler from the Adath Israel congregation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to listen.
Good afternoon, sir.
I can tell you, good afternoon. I can tell you that this is a very difficult time to be a Jew in Toronto, that my congregants and my community are scared, and that they have every right to be. We've heard already today that there have been shootings at Jewish schools and fire bombings at a Jewish deli. As an identifiably Jewish person, I do walk around with the kippah on my head. I personally have been harassed and threatened while walking on the streets of Toronto, both in my neighborhood, which is fairly heavily Jewish, as well as elsewhere in the city, which is not. I know many others as part of my community, in my congregation, who have themselves been threatened or harassed. Jews and Jewish institutions are in danger. CSIS knows this, the police know this. And so what are we going to do about it? So I want to reinforce much of what has already been said. We need more police on the ground. Visibility is essential to deterrence, and you can't have visibility unless you have enough people on the ground. And presence is essential for protest management. A 3-minute drive from where I sit right now, there were protests over the course of many weekends, and were there enough police, they could have been properly contained. Instead, they were disruptive, dangerous, and blockaded entire neighborhoods into their own homes because people couldn't literally exit their neighborhood and go about their day. I can't tell you about cop to pop ratio. I can't tell you what the research says about that. I can tell you from my own experience of being a Jewish community leader in this city that we do not have enough police, and we need more. The community is not safe. And I know that without more police, what we have seen is going to be a drop in the pot. Things are going to get worse here, far worse, unless we have more visible police presence in places where there's likely to be anti-Semitic or other hate-like activity. It's critical that police who are out there on the streets are well trained in things like the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. The Canadian Heritage Ministry recently published a handbook. It is a great place to start. It is a definition which has been endorsed both by the provincial and the federal governments. We need to empower police through training to identify hate crimes as they occur and make arrests whenever they have reason to believe a crime is being committed, and not to have to wait to consult the Crown in order to make an arrest later, which is often impossible because there's no enforcement of the ban of protesting while concealing one's identity. We need better protest management, and in order to get that, we need better education, better training for our police officers. Finally, we need better accountability. The idea of having a hate crime portal has come up before in front of this very board. It has been promised, it has not been put into action. A place where police officers can submit information about hate crimes so that there is a central repository of what is happening around our city. I love this city. I was born in this city, I grew up here. I have never been as scared as I am today to be a Jew in this city. There are protests every week within walking distance of my home. I get yelled at crossing Bathurst Street. This is not okay. Not okay for me. It's not okay for our city. Things will get worse unless we have more police on the ground and unless those police are properly trained to deal with the issues that our community is encountering more and more, not less, but more and more every single day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cutler. Are there any questions for Mr. Cutler? Thank you, Mr. Cutler, for coming out and speaking today. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The next deputant is Leora Shemesh. I don't know if Ms. Shemesh is either virtual. I've got it that she was in person. Do we have her on the line? All right, and appears no, and if Ms. Shemesh does pop up later or appear, we will be happy to hear from her. The next individual is Andrea Vasquez Jimenez from Policing Free Schools.
Can I go next, because I'd like Counselor Chili Carroll to hear about the research?
Yeah, I think she'll just be back in a minute, so if that you would like to hold it down. The next person is Mr. Morin. You ready to go, Derek? Thank you.
So my mom called me Derek, and as I mentioned to Justice of the Peace Bentley Springer recently, that the Crown is the surety for that person I have, which is a foundation that the Crown created in my name. So I think we all know how the City of Toronto likes to cry poor. Thanks to a question Councillor Mantis asked of the CFO, Stephen Conforti, at the Budget Council meeting at the beginning of the year, Mr. Conforti revealed that there's another $1.4 billion, as he put it, budgetary pressure upcoming for this year's budget. So I'm just putting it out there on the record, and we'll see if they try to scam us with another 16.5% proposed tax increase to deal with it. Now, this is what Councillor Gord Perks had to say at the Budget Council meeting at the beginning of the year to approve the 9.5% property tax hike. He said, and that takes me to Councillor Morley's motion, which I will not be able to support. Unlike the conversation we had with tens of thousands of Torontonians where we asked them what the police have done is they have spent public money telling the public not to support the budget. That is not what you do with public money. He said, we have a governance issue at the Police Services Board that we are going to have to look into, that we are going to have to face over the next couple of terms. And until that work is done, personally, I can't support what Councillor Morley is doing. Now, I could tell by the look on his face that he didn't understand when I tried to explain at the 33 Division Town Hall to new PA head Clayton Campbell. When you guys are looking for a raise, right? But I don't think you realize the City of Toronto has the money but they play a shell game with their finances. Remember, about a year ago, Councillor Burnside went into specific detail how the City of Toronto plays shell games with the public's money, and they play a lot of shell games with the public's money. Telling the public where they grossly underspend on their budget every year. I told Clayton they stash that money away out of sight in their reserves and turn around and lie to the public that they ended up with a deficit. So I sent an email to the city CFO, Stephen Conforti, about this. I said, "Hi, Stephen. At City Council today, you took questions from Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Perks on whether the alleged $1.8 billion deficit, shortfall, hole could be dealt with using funds that are already in the city's reserves. You mentioned to Councillor Fletcher about $1 billion that's in a water reserve, and mentioned to Councillor Perks about a reserve fund that has $80 million. You know very well the city has more than just $1.1 billion in its reserves. At Scarborough Budget Subcommittee, Councillor Chang was skeptical of a figure I gave her, that the City of Toronto currently has roughly $12.9 billion in its reserves. I told her I got this information from off a tweet posted by someone by the name of Henrik Beckman. Now, usually I'm used to there being an overhead projector here, but it's not here. I can't show the tweet. But based on Henrik's tweet, is it true that the City of Toronto has in total $12.9 billion in its reserves, reserve funds, deferred revenues? At the bottom of Henrik's tweet, he mentioned, "Nope, we're definitely not broke." And I ended off the email by saying to Stephen, "I just want to make sure you're not lying by omission. Thank you, Derek." Now, there's a friend out there of Mayor Chow's, a guy named George Sowisian. I've actually seen video of Mayor Chow admitting to George that, yeah, we're friends. You and I, we're friends together. George pointed out that the NDP knows what they're doing. They hide $1 billion in a reserve fund to later give union members pay hikes and keep funding NDP activists. So remember when Councillor Carroll suggested a few meetings ago to Mr. Langenfeld that if he was seeking information, that he could always ask a question of staff in the form of a communication, like an email. Well, I've sent an email to Mr. Conforti about this question twice, and he still hasn't got back to me. And since he's present here today, I'm putting Chief Temke on inquiry and respectfully direct him again to inquire of the City of Toronto on whether it's illegal for members of the public to ask questions at city board committee meetings, because it seems like a rather simple question that if we can't, see, how is it that we can't ask questions at City Hall at these meetings, but when I do what Councillor Carroll suggests, no offense to her, I ask a question twice of the CFO, yes or no, I don't get an answer. What does that say? They're concealing, they're suppressing the truth. I've read the case law on this before. They're just pulling scams on the public. It shouldn't be that hard to answer a simple yes or no question. And I just want to end by thanking Mr. Langenfeld for bringing something to my attention recently. And because of it, I have reasons to believe now that I may be the victim of fraud regarding an early resolution meeting that was set up by the City of Toronto, but I'll bring that up at a future regular meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Moore? All right. Thank you. Ms. Jimenez, Councilor Carroll's back. Would you like to speak now? Thank you.
My name is Andrea Vasquez Jimenez. I'm here with Policing Free Schools, and we know that thriving and healthy community and educational spaces, which in and of themselves are safe, have ample support and resources, not more police presence or policing or carceral measures. A Canadian study published December 2023 examined a decade of data from Canada's 20 largest municipalities, including Toronto. And the result of the study was that even as police budgets continue to increase, there is no correlation with increased safety or lower crime rates. Yet there continues to be a false normalized narrative being pushed that safe and safety equates with policing, or increased police spending. As for the false narrative of the cop to population or cop to population plus ratio, Scott Worley, a U of T criminology criminology professor mentioned as to why cop-to-population ratio won't make a safer community. That you only have to look to Chicago, which has a comparable population to Toronto, where there are about 440 officers per 100,000 residents, yet the city sees roughly 10 times the number of homicides every year. In 2023, under Toronto Mayor John Tory, there was a $48.3 million increase to the city's police budget. It was said that the increase was necessary to improve response times. Yet between September 2022 and 2023, as per the deputation to the City of Toronto Budget Committee meeting by Toronto Police Association on January 22, 2024, emergency calls for the service went up 18% and took on average 22 minutes to respond to the highest priority call, the wait time being longer in 18 of 25 municipal wards. In 2024, under Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow, there was an increase of full budget request of $20 million through a voting on Councillor Amber Morley's motion to increase the Toronto Police budget. The rationalization, one of them used again, same as the year before, was that those funds were necessary to improve response times, even when there was no accountability for prior budget increase and worse results. The narrative now is that the average response time for police after receiving a call has been down to 17.5 minutes in the last, quote-unquote, several months. This is in alignment with variables such as the public education awareness campaign, Make the Right Call, and diversifying emergency responses beyond police, including Toronto Community Crisis Service launching citywide. In an annual report from Toronto's Auditor General for 2022, released in January of 2023, stating that police overwhelmingly were servicing calls where police were not necessary. It was reported at that time that 57% of 911 calls were non-emergency. Today, as noted on the TPS website, indicates that the number has decreased to 30%. Of course, times would drop, but not necessarily because of more police. For years, we have continued to see how money is continuously funneled into policing, despite there being ample evidence, data reports, and research telling us what we already know about the systemic impacts and harms of policing, and just as much data reports and research on evidence-based measures that actually supports the conditions for healthy, thriving communities. Yet reformist reforms continue, expanding the reach and scope of policing while simultaneously ballooning the police budget. And no, none of these resolve the manufactured crisis of priority call 1 response times. We are seeing heightened levels of layered policing. Toronto police entrenching themselves into all community spaces and everyday practices, whether it be police hosting youth robotic programs, police giving driving lessons, playing basketball, or police acting as wraparound youth workers for young people, among many other examples. We have been getting complaints from educators, parents, caregivers, guardians, and young people that police are also still going into Toronto schools outside of incident responses, despite the removal of police in school programs. Not only are police not necessary for any of this is the continuation of policing in schools and policing in community youth programming, further entrenching children and youth in conditions within a continuum of surveillance, push-out, criminalization, and possible adverse effects and harm. Within the context of Toronto being dubbed the child poverty capital of Canada by a report by Social Planning Toronto supported by Family Service Toronto's campaign, we are seeing record numbers of child poverty rates. This is a Toronto where police budget siphons funds out of what should be going to our community. What is necessary is divesting from policing and reallocating those funds, refunding our communities into what actually creates real community safety and well-being. Divest funds from the multiple forms of layered and tiered policing, and investing those funds in a range of social support mechanisms, community-based support models, diversifying additional police-free emergency responses, police-free community and youth programming, police-free gun violence and prevention evidence-based programming, such as Advanced Peace. We already have a citywide Toronto Community Crisis Service, detask and divest police-led mobile crisis intervention team program, divest from police budget a total of upwards of $34 million, and invest those funds into TCCS, an unmet promise and passed motion by City Council in 2020. There are multiple other non-reformist reforms that would actually work. What we need is just political will.
Thank you, Ms. Jimenez. Any questions? Thank you. Our next deputant is Daniel Warner. Mr. Warner.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Toronto Police Services Board, My name is Dan Warner. Today I stand before you not only as an advocate for the Jewish community in Toronto, but as a staunch supporter of a Toronto that is safe, inclusive, and committed to upholding the rule of law for all of its citizens. The recent surge in hate crimes and public demonstrations targeting marginalized groups demands urgent action and additional resources through the budget. My recommendations today focus on 3 key areas for budget use: strengthening enforcement, enhancing officer training, and expanding resources for hate crime prevention and analysis. Number 1, strengthening hate crime enforcement and on-site presence. We must deploy dedicated hate crime officers at public demonstrations equipped to monitor and enforce laws in real time. For example, recent protests in my neighborhood at Bathurst and Shepherd reveal how anonymity, through masks enables individuals to incite violence and commit illegal acts. I've seen it myself. It's horrific to see in your own backyard. When those who incite hatred are allowed to act with impunity, it emboldens others to follow, as we've seen over the past 14 months across the city. Immediate arrests for violations such as wearing masks to conceal identity during unlawful assembly and hate speech will act as a powerful deterrent. A proactive presence can prevent these events from escalating into chaos and a riot like we saw in Montreal last week, and reassure communities that their safety is a priority. It doesn't feel that way sometimes. Number 2, comprehensive training and daily briefings for officers. To combat hate crimes effectively, law enforcement must understand them deeply. I, like Matt, propose mandatory IHRA-based training for all officers, ensuring they can recognize anti-Semitic rhetoric and symbols, including the upside-down triangle. Please look it up. It's horrific by intent and design. And distinguish between lawful protests and hate speech, because the line continues to be blurred almost every day across the city. Continuous retraining, and daily intelligence updates are crucial. For example, an inspector's recent ignorance of the Iranian regime's IRGC terrorist designation underscores the dangerous knowledge gaps. Officers who are well informed will enforce evolving laws with precision, ensuring Toronto remains a city where all communities feel protected. Number 3, embed Crown attorneys and expand hate crime expertise. To ensure justice is served, I urge the board to embed Crown attorneys within the hate crimes unit, which I understand is expanding, and I appreciate it. This collaboration will streamline case preparation and prosecution, delivering the accountability our community and communities deserve. Additionally, hiring civilian analysts to specialize in hate crimes, trends, and community outreach will strengthen the unit's capabilities. These experts can analyze patterns, provide actionable intelligence, and foster trust between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. Let me be clear, we are at a critical and very frightening juncture in this city. Toronto's police force is well respected and appreciated. It is also stretched thin. And the current policy of limited enforcement and de-escalation is unsustainable. Laws addressing incitement, vandalism, harassment, and willful promotion of hatred are not being consistently enforced. Officers cannot simultaneously protect themselves, because they are at risk, it seems, the public, and enforce the law without adequate resources, training, and support, including budgetary. Beyond these immediate recommendations, I call for enhanced patrols in Toronto Jewish neighborhoods to safeguard institutions targeted by vandals, shooters, and arsonists. We must also adopt safe access zones around places of worship and community centers, ensuring that no one is targeted simply for their identity and religion. This is not about the Jewish community. It is about the safety and dignity of every Torontonian. A city that fails to address hate crimes and public intimidation and harassment and violence erodes the very fabric of its democracy and its unity that makes it so great. We must act decisively to uphold justice and equality. Thank you for your attention and opportunity today. I urge you to adopt these recommendations and consider them for the budget to protect safety and integrity of our city and all of its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warner. Are any questions for Mr. Warner? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Warner.
Thank you. If I may add, tomorrow we're having a session at City Hall, Committee Room 2 at 9:30, where you will hear similar opinions from different faiths, about a dozen, about their concerns about rising hate and anti-Semitism in the city. So if anyone is interested and available, Councillor, Chief, and everyone else, Please join us to hear from how other committees feel about what's unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you for telling us about that, Mr. Warner. I'm going to, at this point, call one more time Leora Shemesh, either online or in person. So we've done. All right, and I'd also like to acknowledge that there were 2 written submissions by deputants, Phil David from Bassetta Congregation and Michelle Stock from the CIJA. At this point, having completed the deputations, are there any questions for the presentation team? Mr. Brillinger?
Thank you, Chair Morgan. And thank you to all the deputants for all of the information provided. Couple of quick questions. Court security, there's a reference to it being underfunded. Who is responsible for the cost of court security?
So through you, Chair, court security is a provincially downloaded item. So it is provincially funded, and this is the model for the entire province. The reason we say it's underfunded is the actual funding allocated to court security province-wide largely has remained unchanged, but in the process, you know, other services and partner agencies that perform this function have kind of been added. And so when you factor in COLA plus just a larger group that has access to this funding, our proportionate share in turn gets to be a little bit less every year.
Great, thank you. And to board colleagues, that may be a public policy point we want to make during the budget process. If in fact it's a provincial responsibility, why is the province not paying for it? And this board being forced to make budget choices as a result. Slide 12, the civilian composition and hiring plan. The only 2 areas where there was significant movement was support staff and FIN HR professional standards, and roughly the same number, about 30 positions. Was that an organizational movement, or did one group actually shed positions and the other group increase them?
Sorry, I'm just trying to follow what slide you're on. Is this a civilian composition?
Yep, and hiring plan, slide 12.
Yeah.
So under the middle of the chart, the first group under direct support goes up by roughly 30, 28 to be exact, between 24 and 25. You go down to the very bottom column, other FIN HR professional standards. It goes down by roughly 20. Those are the only ones with a significant change, and the overall total doesn't change. So I'm just wondering, is that reflecting an organizational realignment where positions were moved from one category to the other? Or was there actually a shedding of FTEs and then a quite separate addition of FTEs in the other area?
So certainly, I'll follow up and understand exactly what positions kind of moved in between. It is an internal reallocation, but this also might be simply as a result of the org chart that we're trying to realign to, and so a little bit of recategorization. But for the full board, this chart will be there again, and so certainly I can get you those details.
And that's what I would have assumed, but I just wanted to, there's a heck of a lot more work involved if you're actually shedding positions and hiring up somewhere else than if you're just moving organizational units across. My last, I think it's my last question. Slide 31, which is the potential accomplishments and outcomes of the 2025 budget. So there's some really good stuff listed there. When the budget comes forward, will there be measurable KPI targets against some of these good things? So for example, There's a comment, obviously we focus on response times, but the focus on case closure rates. Will there be a target embedded in the budget of increasing closure rate by X percent? Similarly, neighborhood community officer expansion. Will there be a target embedded in the budget around expanding by X officers? It's just these are all very good things and all things we all want to see, but we need to be able to measure from the setting of the budget and ultimately approval of the budget how we did as we go through the year. So it would just be helpful to see some target kind of KPIs that a year from now we can look at and say, okay, investment there worked, investment there didn't.
Yeah, and so to your point, what the full board report does have is it will show, for example, the decrease in response times. It does show the number, an increase in calls attended so that we can demonstrate value. It will show an expansion of up to 4 neighborhoods, which will translate to about 16 officers. We will talk about our number of referrals and whether that's up and down as a result of our investment in community. We will talk about the redirection, like we have seen a slight decrease in mental health calls as a result, I think, of all the other infrastructure that's now there. So you will certainly see things like that to demonstrate impact. Where we're not quite at yet is the target. Like, what are we actually aiming for? And I think that's in part, a strategic plan conversation. It's also a part of, we are now in year 2, I would say, of multi-year hiring. Like, what's the true impact relative to the growth, and how are we reinvesting some of our gains? So I just don't think we're quite at the target stage, but we will absolutely demonstrate with numbers kind of where these investments are going and what have we done with it, for sure. And that is already in the report.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. I understand, Councillor Carroll, you had some comments and questions.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the comment. I think that's one of the downfalls of doing a budget process in using that as the metric for a hiring plan. It looks like that's our only metric, but it's just it's a shorthand way of talking to the hiring plan. Oh yeah, I did. You mentioned right off the top when we were talking about the budget timeline, you said you're still in conversation with the city. They're giving notes on format for the analyst notes, but also on bridging strategy. Is what we're looking at today is pretty much it, though. We just need to populate it with the final numbers.
Yes, the budget by all effects is done. We are writing, we're confirming, and we're figuring out the right format for city notes, but for all intents and purposes, we're done.
So is that the 12.6 from last year that we added at the last minute to round up the hiring? Is that still being bridged? Is that still being held in that mysterious special events fund sort of thing? It's not quite embedded yet?
So the 12.6, we did receive confirmation that is going to be included in our base for as long as the new Ontario deal is in place. So we, in our outlook, you'll see we take it out in about 2027. The special events fund, and we'll talk, is out. That one already left.
Right.
And so we talk about just the risk and the pressure, but kind of what we're doing to mitigate that. So those are the kind of bridging conversations we're having, because there are still things that are in that I would say are not necessarily long-term sustainable. Even our reserves, we're kind of using in-year strategies to make sure that our reserves are adequately topped up.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily budgeting for it up front to the level that we need to make sure. So it's things like that that certainly will require us and city finance to stay connected for the next few years.
So having it there to the end of New Deal means the New Deal Part 2 should be not just, can you please continue this 12.6, but we need something permanent and sustainable here. We just demonstrated the need for it. Okay. Okay. What else? When we were talking about the hiring and that reform activities, we need to start doing reform activities. but once we make those reforms, we'll still need, you said we'll still need officers to do the work. So maybe unpack reform a little bit, where we're at and where we're going with that, because I think the community expectation is we're doing reforms so that some of this is detasking officers and sending them off to do the sort of primary response types of policing. So is it reform is a mixture of things?
Yeah, I think for us, reform is a very broad term. You have reform, things like the Auditor General's report, things like OHRC just released a report, which is we're still digesting and unpacking. We released an equity strategy that certainly commits the organization over the long term. We're nearing, I think, the end of the 81 recommendations of reform, but certainly there's still things in there. And then the other part of reform, outside of the systemic pieces, is actually the technology, which will require, so the new RMS, that still requires subject matter experts and a whole host of officers to test and prove it out and make sure that it's configured the right way. So when we're talking about where net new officers go, we don't budget for project work because you know that starts and stops. But what we're really allocating for net new headcount is obviously going to be the front line and its investigative areas and its community-facing neighborhood officer expansion, things like that. So internally, when we do find projects come up, like all of the reform work and like some of the modernization, that's where you start to figure out, now where are you borrowing part-time capacity or temporary capacity? Even FIFA prep is a good example where FIFA's funded, but you still got to potentially backfill. So it's just, so all we're trying to say is that there is still work that is not necessarily response, that is not necessarily investigations, but still needs to happen in the organization because we've made a lot of commitments to change, whether it's culture and technology and so on. And so in order to satisfy those needs, and any other new emerging thing that may come our way, like Project Resolute wouldn't have been on our bingo card last year, that's where internal reallocation and internal shuffling and figuring out which service delivery is either going to change or be reduced or augmented. That's the internal reallocation that is just regular part of our business that even with the hiring plan, we're still going to need to do.
Okay. And if I can ask, this is a purely numbers question. When we're looking at the hiring strategy going forward, there are no projections for lateral hires. Is that because we only put them in as actuals? We don't project likely number of laterals that might come to us?
Yeah, so for two things. From an affordability of the hiring plan, cadets obviously come at a much lower rate, and so we're leaning exclusively on a cadet strategy as the first option. Where laterals will come into play is should our separations be higher or lower than what we think, we will then lean on laterals as a stopgap, but we will not plan for them up front. So we will likely still attract like a small class of laterals, but it'll be based on where are we at in our hiring plan and do we see gaps relative to where our year-end strength is going to be.
Right. I have a bunch of other questions, but I think, Madam Chair, I'm taking up too much time, so I'm just going to jump straight to capital to 5455. Is there do we have a subcommittee or a strategy committee working on this? Because I was kind of surprised when I saw the presentation that we're now back to having a 54 and a 55, and now they're both going to be the same size, and underground parking to boot. So I'm wondering if is there a strategy on this, or is it too late to have a strategy? Let me just load in all my questions. Is there any possibility of 3 Dome Avenue? Because that's a very interesting site. I don't know what the conversation with Create looks like about that. Where are we at in this, or is it too pressing to look at those things now?
So I never want to say we're past the point of no return on things like this, but I think what probably doesn't always come to the board is the level of conversations we've had. We have looked at 3 Dome, we've looked at East York Civic, we've been working with Create TO for a few years. We also have reassembled, in a way, kind of parts of the TTF team and the staff supers that are there today to really understand what's working, what's not, where does the operation need to go. And so, you know, the challenge with the 3-dome or this Danforth garage is a few things. One, Danforth garage is a good example. The footprint actually is.
Where's that one?
It's where the TTC is. The TTC is
right,
right now
right.
doing all sorts
Okay.
of construction
Yeah,
around it.
yeah.
So the ability for TTC to do their construction and us to do ours on a very small, constrained site was actually very logistically difficult. The land available, it's less than an acre, and every time it seems like our partners' plans seem to encroach more and more on what truly is available to accommodate growth there. So
Yeah.
there's a lot that's not feasible there.
Kind of too counselor driven, that part of it.
East York and 3-dome, the challenge with both of them and what you
It's a
don't
special
see.
place, East York, sorry.
And what you don't see in the cost estimates
Yeah.
is the cascading impact of moving the organizations that are already there out. So this is purely a TPS cost, but if you look at the total, like to the taxpayer,
Yeah.
there's a cascading impact of moving Toronto Public Health somewhere else, and who's bearing that cost. And same with 3-dome. There's also questions around land availability for both sites in terms of timing, and we've now been in like this hold mode for 2 years. And so when you factor all of it in, you know, the easiest was really to take our own buildings that we already have and figure and raise them and just rebuild. At the end, cost-wise, you're probably going to end up at the same spot. But we have been in active conversations with Create TO on what is available. It is really limited to make big stations and think about where the city's going from a growth, traffic, density, and not compromise kind of response times with it. So I think, you know, while amalgamated stuff academically makes sense, I think the on-the-ground operations suggest travel time is actually a very key part of our response. So, you know, there's still room to look at the 54-55 plan in terms of where's the swing space? Can you optimize cost further? Can you shrink the time? Do you really need, you know, both of these, kind of the amount of space or parking? But we are trying to create a model that allows for a bit of growth and that can
Okay.
be scalable, where we're right now
For
at
the
the
golden
mercy
mile.
of many other existing tenants and construction schedules that really put then this project completely kind of unpredictable and at risk.
And one more question about it is, does all of this take into account that kind of nutty realignment of O'Connor? Do we know whether that is happening, and is 54 Division in the way of that? Or is that not going ahead?
I would have to confirm back on that. Certainly, I can follow up and confirm at the next meeting on what the implications of that are.
Yeah.
What this allows us to do is at least solidify a path.
Yeah.
So we can start to get into the nitty-gritty decisions. And,
Right.
you know, one of the things that kind of stopped this ahead of time was how deep you had to go underground. So at least
Right.
we have certainty now that some of these things are now a bit more mitigated. We're only going 1 level, not 5, and things like that as are contemplated in like a Danforth. So, but certainly I'll follow up on the O'Connor piece. And that'll get teased out as we now, with some certainty, can really start to plan in a direction.
Right,
Whereas I think
right.
before we were just completely stalled.
I just remember when I saw the map thinking Division 54 will be at the front of O'Connor instead of embedded in a neighborhood, because it looked like it bumped right up against the property. But that's a number of years back. Maybe that's not necessary now to complete the Golden Mile. You'll find out. Yeah, okay.
We will follow up.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Member Migliori, do you have any questions? All right. Appears we're not sure if he's online. So at this point, if there are no other questions, what I propose to do is have a motion for item number 1 to receive, and that was the Toronto Police Service Budget Update presentation.
Can I just make a comment on it before we go?
Please do.
I just wanted to make a comment because I'm still not sure that it was completely understood by the first deputant that while we're looking at the presentation today and it's not quite finalized because the city and the Toronto Police Service are working well together and getting to that point. But we did hear, today was the biggest and best opportunity to give deputation, so we heard them all. And I just wanted to make sure that people understand that I'm only speaking for myself now, but I feel like it's this way in the board and council too. We all deeply understand socioeconomic duty, and you can't meet that purely with policing, that we have to do it. But I have to say that there are the pressures. There are also the pressures. If you look at the city manager's survey, that is, I think, the most recent one, because it came even after the forum research done here. Still, the things that people want us to be investing in right now go housing, transportation, crime. Housing, transportation, crime. No matter how you slice it. The city manager asked the question 3 different ways. And I know that's a broad thing to say, what's your need? And then you take all the answers and lump them into a topic called crime. But I firmly believe that what it is we're kind of at a tipping point. If you go all the way back to the Transformation Task Force, we said we were going to be able to reduce policing by doing all these other things, including detasking, including technological innovation, and all of the rest. And it appears as if we did the first part. We reduced the piece. We reduced the officers. We didn't load in the other things. And now here we are needing to do them. And not only did we reduce the officers, because the Transformational Task Force said where you need to be investing is proactively upstream, the city meeting its socioeconomic duty. That wasn't happening either. Reducing officers and not really investing a lot in social program. We kept shortchanging over there. So now we find ourselves at a point where, like it or not, we have to do both. At the moment, we actually do need officers, and we do need to be investing at City Hall. And council is very much doing that right now in a number of ways for the first time in a very long time. But I really feel strongly that at the moment we need to do both. We just do need to do both. You can enrich training and enhance sensitivity and understanding only if you can release an officer for a day to go do that training. And we're so short that we can't. We can't send them off to learn what is a sensitive way. I'd just like every officer on staff to even be able to pronounce the word Rosh Hashanah. And we're not even there yet. Like that's the level of sensitivity training we got to make sure we're doing for the tensions that exist right now. And we don't have the bodies to stop and do that. And so we really have to do all things at once right now. That's expensive, but I feel strongly that it's necessary. And so I know that there's some time between now and when we get to the board, but I just have to say, we heard deputants from both sides, but if you can think of a way where we can address both at one time and not have it cost money or invest all in one area and have the impact spring up here immediately, let me know, because I've searched my soul looking for it for the last few months, and I think we're just at a tipping point where we need to invest on both sides until we're at a sweet spot. And then we can really and truly double down on the upstream stuff. We can say that's the only place we need to invest, but at the moment, that's just not the case, in my view. Those are my comments. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. So at this point, I'm going to make a motion to receive item number 1. May I have a seconder? I think there's only 2 of us now, so. Item number 1 is received. Item number 2, which was the report from Dr. Kennegisser, the Toronto Police Services Board 2025 operating budget request. I'm going to make a motion to approve. Can Can I have a seconder?
Can we say approve with thanks? Because I know that Dr. Kanagisser really went to the mat to try and get it to the number it's at. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Having dealt with both those, item number 1 and item number 2, and I thank everyone who came out today with your very thoughtful and very eloquent submissions. And I think, as Councillor Carroll expressed, it's not an easy task where the needs are equally great in the socioeconomic and poverty issues and social issues, and then are in policing to keep the neighborhoods safe. So having that, can I have a motion to adjourn?
My favorite motion.
Yeah. And the next board meeting will be December 12th, 2024 at police headquarters. Thank you, everyone who came out today.